There is a war happening inside you right now, not between you and the world, between you and yourself, the anxious mind fighting its own anxiety, the worried mind worrying about its worry, the self that watches itself watching until the whole apparatus seizes with the effort of managing what cannot be managed from within. You have been told this war can be won, that the right strategies, the right practices, the right level of self-awareness will finally resolve it. What almost no one tells you is that the war itself is the illusion, and the general prosecuting it does not exist in the way you believe it does. This is not a metaphor. It is not a spiritual consolation for people who are too tired to keep fighting. It is a structural description of the exact mechanism by which ordinary human life becomes chronic psychological suffering, and why that suffering increases in direct proportion to the effort applied to ending it. The mechanism has a shape. It can be traced, and once traced, once seen clearly from outside its own logic, it does something unusual. It begins to lose its grip, not because you have defeated it, because you have stopped feeding it with the energy of a war it was never capable of winning. Right now, in the background of whatever you are doing, there is a process running that you did not choose to install and cannot choose to uninstall. It narrates, it evaluates. It compares what is happening to what should be happening, what you have to what others have, what you are to what you are supposed to become. It projects the current moment forward into futures it has manufactured and backward into pasts it has reconstituted. It is never satisfied with what is. Its purpose, as far as it has one, seems to be the prevention of danger, and since danger is everywhere in a complex social world, it runs continuously. No rest, no off switch, never quiet. You call this your mind. You identify with it so completely that when someone asks who you are, you reach instinctively for its contents. Your opinions, your memories, your plans, your fears. The voice in the head is not something you have. It is, as far as ordinary experience is concerned, something you are. This identification is the illusion, not a delusion in any clinical sense, not a lie you were told and could have avoided. It is the most basic cognitive misunderstanding available to a human being, so thoroughly baked into the architecture of language and socialization that it operates below the threshold of examination in almost every waking moment of every life. The misunderstanding is this, that you are a separate self, enclosed inside a body, looking out at a world that is fundamentally other than you. The task of life, in this framework, is to manage that world, control it, extract from it the conditions required for survival and happiness, and protect the self from everything that threatens it. This is not a philosophy you consciously adopted. It is the water you swam in from the moment language began structuring your experience. The grammar of the sentence, "I feel afraid," divides the world into an I who feels and a condition of afraid that the I is experiencing, as if the fear were a weather event happening to a person standing outside it. The structure of the language is the structure of the illusion, and because you have thought in that language since before you can remember, the illusion feels like bedrock. It is not bedrock, it is the trap. Now look at this from a different altitude. Step outside the first-person narrative for a moment and watch what happens when a creature believes itself to be separate from the world it inhabits. The creature that is separate must be protected, because if you are a thing inside a world, the world is also capable of ending you. Every threat to the body, every social rejection, every failure, every uncertainty becomes existentially significant. A separate self can, in principle, be destroyed. The machinery of fear activates not for genuine mortal dangers, which are rare, but for anything that resembles the structure of a threat. Criticism, uncertainty, loss of status, the unpredictability of other people. The separate self lives in a permanent low-grade emergency. It monitors, it anticipates, it defends against imagined disasters before they arrive. It cannot rest, because resting requires trusting a world that the framework of separateness has already designated as unreliable. Control follows from the same premise. If the world is other than you, and you require things from it, love, safety, certainty, meaning, then those things must be extracted, secured, maintained. You must manage the perceptions others have of you. You must ensure that the future arranges itself in accordance with your plans. You must suppress in yourself anything that might make you unacceptable to others, or to yourself, which amounts to the same operation at a different level. Control is not a personality trait of anxious people. It is the logical consequence of believing yourself to be separate. If you are inside the world, you must manage the world. There is no other option, and a self that can succeed or fail must constantly be evaluated. The self becomes both the subject of assessment and the assessor. It stands outside itself and grades itself. The self-monitoring is not neurotic. It is the inevitable consequence of a structure in which the self exists as an object in its own perceptual field, subject to the same comparative scrutiny it applies to everything else. This is what ordinary human suffering looks like from outside its own logic, a creature in permanent self-defense, a creature trying to control the conditions of its own happiness from a position it cannot actually occupy, a creature that has split itself in two, the one who lives and the one who judges the living, and can never put itself back together because the glue it uses to try is the same thing doing the splitting. Alan Watts devoted much of his intellectual life to naming this structure precisely and to tracing where it came from. His most sustained treatment appears in a book published in 1966 called The Book on the Taboo Against Knowing Who You Are. The title names the mechanism directly. There is, Watts argued, a cultural prohibition, not explicit, never formally declared, enforced entirely through the structure of upbringing and language, against knowing what you actually are. And what you actually are, Watts contended, is not a separate entity looking out at the world. You are a process through which the world is happening, not a thing in the universe, a mode of the universe's behavior. Watts used a specific image for this, one he returned to across multiple lectures and writings. The separate self, he said, is like a whirlpool in a river. A whirlpool is a real pattern. It has a location, a shape, a duration. You can point at it. You can watch it. But it is not separate from the river. It is made of the river, sustained by the river, and will eventually resolve back into the river without leaving a gap. The whirlpool does not contain river water, the way a cup contains water. The whirlpool is what the river does at that particular place and time. Watts' claim was that the human organism is related to the universe in the same way. You are not a separate thing that arrived in the world. You are what the world is doing here, now, in this particular configuration. The sensation of being a separate entity, of being in the world rather than of it, Watts identified as the central cultural delusion of the Western tradition, reinforced by millennia of theological and philosophical frameworks that positioned the self as something distinct from, even opposed to, the natural world. In The Wisdom of Insecurity, published in 1951, Watts made the same argument from a different angle. He was not, in that book, primarily concerned with ontology, with what the self actually is. He was concerned with the experiential consequences of the illusion of separateness, and specifically, with what it does to the texture of lived life. His central observation was that the more a human being attempts to secure its existence, to make the future certain, to protect the self against loss, to accumulate the conditions that will finally make it safe, the more anxious it becomes, because every act of grasping confirms the fear that there is something to be lost. Security sought through control generates more insecurity, not occasionally, structurally, as a matter of the mechanism's internal logic. The medicine, Watts was saying, is the poison, and the antidote is not a better medicine. It is the recognition that the problem was never what the medicine was supposed to cure. To understand why the illusion generates suffering, you have to understand what the self actually is, not metaphysically, not spiritually, but as a psychological and cognitive structure, because the structure is the mechanism, and the mechanism is what produces the experience. The sense of being a self, a continuous bounded, coherent I persisting through time, is a construction. This is not a claim imported from Eastern philosophy. Cognitive science has spent decades arriving at the same conclusion from a very different starting point. The experience of selfhood is assembled, in real time, from multiple neural processes that are not themselves unified. Sensory data, bodily signals, memory retrieval, predictive modeling, language processing, social modeling of others' perceptions of you. There is no single place in the brain where you live. There is no central observer watching the show from behind your eyes. What you experience as a unified self is a model, a very convincing one, generated by the brain as a tool for navigating a complex social environment. Daniel Kahneman, in his 2011 synthesis of decades of cognitive research, Thinking Fast and Slow, makes a distinction that touches this directly. He describes two systems of cognitive processing, one fast, automatic, intuitive, operating below the threshold of conscious awareness, and one slow, deliberate, effortful, narrative generating. The slow system, the one you identify as you thinking, is not, Kahneman argues, actually in charge of most of what you do. It is a narrator constructing post hoc explanations for decisions the fast system has already made, and experiencing those explanations as deliberate choice. The sense of being a rational agent consciously directing your own life is, in significant part, a story the slow system tells about the fast system's behavior. The general takes credit for the army's movements after the fact. Kahneman's two-system framework is not a fringe position. It sits at the center of contemporary cognitive research. And it matters here because the separate self, the one who believes it must control life, is this narrative construction. The controller is the story. The one who suffers is the character. And the suffering is, in large part, the consequence of the character taking itself to be the author. Go one level deeper. The self is not only a cognitive construction, it is a construction that believes itself to be real. And believing itself to be real, it generates behavior consistent with that belief. It protects itself, monitors itself, tries to control its environment, attempts to make permanent what is by nature impermanent. These behaviors feed back into the construction and reinforce it. The self that believes it is real generates experiences that seem to confirm its reality. The whirlpool thinks it is steering the river, and the more it tries to steer, the more turbulent the water becomes, which the whirlpool interprets as confirmation that it needs to try harder. This is the loop. Suffering is not a punishment visited on the separate self from outside. Suffering is what the separate self does. Here is the paradox at the center of all of this. It is the point where ordinary understanding tends to get stuck. If the self is an illusion, if the separate controller does not exist in the way it appears to exist, then the obvious move is to dismantle the illusion, dissolve the self, see through the construction, and arrive at whatever is on the other side. Meditate, practice non-attachment, study non-dualist philosophy until the ego releases its grip. But look at who is doing that. Look at who wants to dissolve the ego. Who is trying to achieve the state of non-separation? Who is working toward the experience of being one with the universe? The ego, the separate self. The construction that believes itself real is now using the tools of spiritual practice to achieve the goal of its own dissolution. The very act of trying reinforces the structure it claims to be dismantling. The self that tries to stop being a self is still being a self. The effort is the evidence of the problem. The striving toward liberation is the cage. Watts described this paradox with particular sharpness in a lecture recorded at the Esalen Institute in 1969. He pointed out that every spiritual path that positions liberation as a goal to be achieved by an individual through sustained effort has already conceded the game to the illusion. If there is a you working toward enlightenment, there is still a you. The goal is still being chased by a chaser. The future is still being organized by a self that has not yet arrived. And the not yet arrived self is, by definition, the anxious self, the one that is waiting, managing, efforting its way toward a condition it cannot reach by effort. This is not an argument against practice. It is an argument against the framework within which practice is usually understood. The problem is not that people do not meditate enough, or do not read enough, or do not understand the philosophy with sufficient precision. The problem is the relationship to the practice, who is doing it, and why, and what they expect to gain. The Zen tradition has been making a version of this argument for over 1,000 years. The koan, those apparently nonsensical questions Zen masters use to disorient the student, operates precisely here. What was your original face before your parents were born? Is not a riddle with a hidden answer. It is a device for making the question-generating apparatus run into itself at full speed. The koan cannot be answered by the thinking mind. And the moment the thinking mind genuinely recognizes this, not as an abstract proposition, but as an immediate experience of the machinery grinding against a wall, something shifts. Not because an answer has been found, because the asker has momentarily disappeared. The teacher Huang Po, whose teachings were recorded in 9th century China, put it this way: The foolish reject what they see, not what they think. The wise reject what they think, not what they see. The problem is not the world. The problem is the apparatus constructing a self that stands in opposition to the world and then finds the world dangerous. The Advaita Vedanta tradition of India reaches the same conclusion through a different route, and its language names something the Western framework tends to miss. Advaita, which means roughly not two, holds that the fundamental error of ordinary human experience is the belief in duality, the separation between the self and Brahman, the underlying reality of which all phenomena are expressions. This is not a claim about God in the Western sense. It is a structural observation about the nature of consciousness. The self, in Advaita, is not an illusion that needs to be destroyed. It is the cosmic reality that has temporarily forgotten itself, the way a wave might, if waves could think, forget that it is made of ocean. Ramana Maharshi, the 20th century Indian sage who spent most of his adult life at the foot of the hill of Arunachala in Tamil Nadu, used a specific practice for working with this. The question, who am I? Not as a philosophical investigation to be conducted with concepts, but as a direct inquiry to be turned back on, the one asking. When you ask, who am I? You find thoughts, memories, sensations, roles, names. Maharshi's instruction was to keep asking, not who has these things, but what is aware of them. What is watching the thoughts? And then, what is aware of the watcher? At some point, he argued, the chain of regression runs out, not into nothingness, but into a bare awareness that cannot be further objectified because it is the subject of all objectification. That awareness, Maharshi held, is what you are, and it has never been separate. It has never been in danger. It has never needed to control anything. The Mandukya Upanishad, one of the oldest texts in the Vedic tradition, describes 4 states of consciousness: waking, dreaming, deep sleep, and a 4th state it calls turiya, which is not a state at all, but the witness that is present across all states. Turiya is not something you achieve. It is what you already are, prior to the construction of the separate self. The instruction, if there is one, is not to attain turiya. It is to recognize that it was never absent. This recognition, not as an intellectual proposition, but as a direct experience, is what the Vedantic tradition calls moksha, liberation. And it is liberation not from suffering exactly, but from the misunderstanding that generated the suffering. The suffering was never visited on you from outside. It was the inevitable consequence of a case of mistaken identity, maintained by the mental habit of treating the narrative construction as the fundamental reality. The Taoist tradition arrives at the same place from an entirely different direction, which is itself worth considering. When traditions with no historical contact converge on the same structural description, that convergence is harder to dismiss than any single tradition's claims. The Tao Te Ching, attributed to Lao Tzu and composed somewhere around the 6th century before the Common Era, opens with a line that has been translated approximately 10,000 times, and that resists definitive translation for structural reasons. The To that can be named is not the eternal To. What Lao Tzu is pointing at is the reality that underlies and pervades all phenomena, not a God, not a force in any simple sense, but the fundamental nature of how things are. And what the text returns to again and again is the problem that arises when the human being positions itself as something separate from this underlying nature and attempts to manage or improve upon it. The concept of Wu Wei, often translated as non-action or effortless action, is the Taoist response to the same paradox Watts was articulating. Wu Wei does not mean passivity. It means action that arises from alignment with the nature of things, rather than from the effort of a self that is trying to impose its will on a world it experiences as other than itself. The Tao Te Ching, in chapter 48, makes the point directly. In pursuit of learning, every day something is acquired. In pursuit of Tao, every day something is dropped. The accumulation of knowledge, of techniques for managing life, this is the way of the separate self. The way of Tao is subtraction, not the addition of more control, but the relaxation of the grip that was never holding anything. Chuang Tzu, the later Taoist philosopher, uses a story to make the same point in a way that is harder to argue with than any abstract proposition. He describes a cook who cuts up an ox so effortlessly that his knife never dulls, not because he is an exceptionally skilled cutter, but because he has learned to follow the natural spaces in the ox's body, rather than forcing the blade through resistance. He does not fight the ox, he moves with it. The knife finds the space. The cook is not absent from the action. He is fully present in it, but as a mode of the action itself, rather than as a separate agent imposing himself on the material. This is what Wu Wei looks like as experience rather than concept, not the disappearance of the self, not the dissolution of the person, but the absence of the friction that arises when the self positions itself as something that must fight its way through a resistant world. The world is not resisting. The resistance is what separation feels like. Contemporary neuroscience touches this. Though the precision matters, what the research actually shows differs from what it's often claimed to show. There is a network of brain regions that becomes active during what researchers call the resting state, when a person is not engaged in a specific external task. This network, identified in detail through functional magnetic resonance imaging studies in the late 1990s and early 2000s, has come to be known as the default mode network. It includes regions of the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, and the angular gyrus. When this network is active, the brain is doing something very specific. It is processing self-referential information. It is thinking about the self, its past, its future, its relationships, its ongoing story. The default mode network is, in a very real sense, the neural substrate of the separate self. This network is also consistently associated with rumination, mind-wandering, and depressive ideation. It is what runs when you are not attending to anything in particular, and what it runs is you, in the abstract, rehearsing your own story. Matthew Killingsworth and Daniel Gilbert, in a 2010 study conducted through Harvard University involving experience sampling of over 2,000 adult participants, found that human beings spend roughly 47% of their waking hours with their attention directed away from whatever they are actually doing, and that this mind-wandering correlates with lower reported happiness regardless of the content of the wandering thoughts. The mind that is elsewhere is, on average, an unhappy mind, not because it is thinking about bad things, because it is not here. What Killingsworth and Gilbert were measuring, without using the language of philosophy, is the experiential consequence of default mode network dominance, the self-referential narrative that generates the sense of a separate entity, located in the past and future rather than the present, is the same mechanism that produces the baseline of chronic low-grade dissatisfaction that most people in developed societies identify as normal. Normal is not the same as natural. Normal is the statistical mean of a population in which a particular misunderstanding has been systematically reinforced. Jaak Panksepp, the neuroscientist who spent much of his career mapping the primary emotional systems of the mammalian brain, made a distinction that bears on this directly. He identified what he called the seeking system, a neural circuit associated with curiosity and forward engagement with the world, as one of the primary sources of positive affect in mammalian experience. The seeking system is active when an organism is engaged with its environment, following interest, moving towards something. What tends to suppress it is exactly the pattern associated with the default mode network, the self-referential loop that replaces direct engagement with ongoing narrative management. When you are inside the story of yourself, rather than inside your actual experience, the seeking system goes quiet. What remains is the ruminating, monitoring machinery of the separate self, and that machinery does not generate happiness. It generates the surveillance state that has mistaken its own activity for being alive. Terror management theory, developed by Jeff Greenberg, Sheldon Solomon, and Tom Piszczynski, based on the earlier work of the cultural anthropologist Ernest Becker, adds another layer to this picture. Their research program, conducted across hundreds of studies over several decades, demonstrates that the awareness of death is a central driver of human anxiety, and that much of what looks like ordinary social behavior is, beneath the surface, a strategy for managing this awareness. The separate self, aware of its own finitude, seeks symbolic immortality through cultural achievement, group membership, ideological identity. When the awareness of death is made salient in experimental conditions, research subjects show measurably increased attachment to their worldview, increased hostility toward those who challenge it, and increased investment in the markers of cultural belonging that seem to offer transcendence of individual mortality. The separate self is afraid of death because it is separate. And much of what humans do, the striving, the accumulating, the desperate need to matter, is this fear organized into behavior. The suffering is not incidental. It is load-bearing. It is what the structure produces when a temporary process mistakes itself for a permanent thing. Now consider what it means that understanding all of this does not fix it. You can read every word of this description. You can follow the logic with complete clarity. You can understand, intellectually, that the separate self is a construction, that the default mode network is the machinery of self-referential suffering, that Wu Wei is the structural alternative to the war of control, that Watts was pointing at something real, and none of it will change the experience of being inside the loop, because understanding is itself an operation of the separate self. The self that reads about its own unreality remains real, at least to itself, in the act of reading. This is not a failure of the argument. It is the argument's most important point. The shift that matters is not conceptual. It is not the acquisition of better information about the self. It is a change in the relationship between awareness and the content of experience, a change that cannot be achieved by the mechanism that is producing the problem, because that mechanism is what would need to change. Watts described this shift in different ways across his work, but one of his most precise formulations appears in a lecture from the late 1960s that he gave to an audience that had, presumably, read everything available on the subject and still found themselves suffering. He said, and this is not a direct quotation but a reconstruction of the argument, that the problem with trying to wake up is that waking up is not something you do. It is something that happens when the doing stops. Not the stoppage of all activity, the stoppage of the specific activity of a self, trying to get somewhere by trying. And that stoppage is not something you can engineer, because engineering is the activity of the self. You can, however, notice that the trying is happening. And in the gap between the noticing and the trying, in the space where awareness meets content without immediately identifying with the content, something is already different. This is not enlightenment. This is not liberation. This is not a solution to the problem of the separate self. It is a moment of something that has no good name in English, a moment in which the usual tension between the observer and the observed briefly relaxes, not because a technique succeeded, but because the technique running temporarily ceased. That moment does not need to be extended, improved upon, or used as evidence of spiritual progress. The moment is complete in itself, and the self that tries to repeat it, or stabilize it, or turn it into a practice is back in the loop, which is fine. The loop is also what the world is doing here. The acceptance and commitment therapy tradition in contemporary psychology, developed by Stephen Hayes over several decades and now among the most empirically validated approaches in clinical psychology, uses the term cognitive fusion to describe the state in which a person is completely identified with their thoughts. When the thought, "I am worthless," is not experienced as a thought, but as a fact about the world. Diffusion, in Hayes's framework, is the process by which a person learns to experience thoughts, as events in the mind, rather than windows onto reality. Not the elimination of negative thoughts, not the replacement of bad thoughts with good ones. The recognition that the thought is a thought. The parallel with what Watts and the Vedantic tradition were describing is not perfect. Hayes is working within a behavioral and empirical framework, while Watts was working within a philosophical and experiential one. But the overlap is striking. Diffusion is not the same as enlightenment, but it is structurally related to the same shift, a change in the relationship between the observing awareness and the content being observed, without any change in the content itself. The thoughts remain, the fusion dissolves, and with the fusion and much of the suffering that was built into it. What the psychological research shows across multiple studies measuring diffusion interventions is that the shift from "I am anxious" to "I am noticing a sensation of anxiety" produces measurable reductions in the intensity of the experience and in its behavioral consequences, without any reduction in the frequency of the anxious thoughts themselves. The content has not changed. The relationship to the content has. This is not, in the end, a different claim from the one Watts was making when he said that the suffering is not caused by the events of life, but by the way the separate self relates to those events. The science and the philosophy are pointing at the same door from opposite sides. So let's be precise about what this does not mean. It does not mean that suffering is not real. It does not mean that pain should be transcended or that difficulty should be denied. The Taoist tradition does not say the river is not cold. The Vedantic tradition does not say the ox's horn does not hurt when it strikes. Watts was careful, across his work, to distinguish between pain, which is an inevitable feature of embodied existence, and the layer of suffering that is added to pain by a self that cannot accept it, cannot simply be with it. The pain is real. The war against the pain is the illusion. And the war is more exhausting than the pain. It does not mean that action is impossible or that nothing matters. The recognition that the self is a construction does not imply that the construction should stop functioning. The whirlpool still spins. The cook still cuts. The action continues, but without the friction of a self that is fighting against the nature of what is happening. Wu Wei is not paralysis. It is engagement without the weight of a desperate separation between the engager and the engaged. And it does not mean that understanding is sufficient. Everything described here is a map. The territory is your actual experience in this moment, in the body you have, in the life that is happening. Maps are useful. They do not substitute for the territory. The person who has read everything about swimming and never entered the water is not a swimmer. The person who has understood, conceptually, that the separate self is a construction, and has not sat with that understanding in the actual texture of lived experience, in the irritation of traffic, in the shame of failure, has understood something, not yet arrived anywhere. Alan Watts, in one of his later recorded conversations, made an observation that functions almost as a summary of everything his work was pointing toward. He was not speaking about enlightenment or liberation or any elevated state. He was speaking about what happens in an ordinary moment when the machinery of the separate self momentarily relaxes its grip. He said, and here the reconstruction will have to do, because the exact phrasing has not survived, that there are moments in everyone's life when the war stops. Not because a battle has been won, not because the conditions were finally right, but because the self forgot, for a moment, to keep the war going. And in those moments, the world is already sufficient. The moment is already complete. Nothing is missing. Nothing needs to be managed or secured. What is here is what is. And what is, without the self's resistance to it, not a problem. He was not promising that this would last, or suggesting that the appropriate response is to try to make it last. He was pointing out that it is already available, that it has always been available, and that the thing preventing it is not the absence of the right conditions, but the presence of a self that has confused its own activity for the problem the activity was supposed to solve. The illusion that keeps you suffering is not a mistake you made. It is not a failure of intelligence or spiritual development. It is the natural consequence of a structure, linguistic, cultural, neurological, that cannot help but produce the experience of separation. The self that suffers because of the illusion is not at fault. It did not choose to believe in its own separateness any more than a whirlpool chooses to believe it is different from the river. But the suffering was never the river's fault, and the whirlpool was never the war it was fighting. The voice in the head is still running. It will keep running. That is what it does. But something about the way you are hearing it right now, having followed this to its end, may have shifted just slightly, in a way that is difficult to name and does not require naming. That shift is not a solution. It is not an arrival. It is simply the recognition that you were never as separate as you thought you were. And that was always the whole thing.